The night before her execution, a teenage queen knelt alone in her cell, practicing how to die. Again and again, she laid her head on the wooden block, rehearsing the moment an axe would sever it from her body. She was just 19 years old. Before we uncover what led to this nightmare, subscribe and join the thousands who crave history's darkest truths. Her name was Catherine Howard, fifth wife of Henry VIII, a girl who rose from nothing to become Queen of England, only to fall into a nightmare beyond imagination. What could drive a king to execute his own teenage bride? What secrets did she hide? And why did she spend her final night rehearsing her own death? This is her true story. Before Catherine Howard was a queen rehearsing her own death, she was just another forgotten girl in a crowded aristocratic household. No crown, no jewels, no protection. Only a family name that carried weight at court and a childhood that left her dangerously unprepared for the world she was about to enter. She was sent as a young girl to live in the household of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, at Chesworth and later Lambeth. On paper, this was an honor. Noble children were placed in great houses to be shaped into polished courtiers, taught music, manners, dancing, reading, the art of pleasing powerful people. In reality, Catherine's world was chaotic, noisy, and barely supervised. The dormitory where she slept was a long shared chamber filled with beds and trunks, home to a mix of young girls and older teens. By day, they embroidered, practiced music, and learned how to move gracefully through a hall. By night, order collapsed. Servants slipped in and out. Whispered laughter rose from shadowy corners. Doors opened that should have stayed locked. A dowager duchess was elderly, distracted, and often absent. Her officials were more interested in their own comfort than the virtue of the girls under their care. In that darkness, Catherine's fate began to twist. One of the men who moved through this world was Henry Mannix, a music master. He was older, and he held power. He decided who was talented, who was favored, who was worth his time. Catherine, young and eager to please, became his focus. Their relationship did not begin as a romance between equals. He was a man using his position over a teenage girl who barely understood how dangerous gossip could be. What began as lessons turned into touches, secrets, and moments she could not safely refuse. The other girls saw more than anyone admitted aloud. They heard muffled sounds from behind curtains, saw figures moving at hours when a respectable household should be still. In that environment, Catherine learned early that attention from men came with both gifts and unspoken threats. It was not love. It was survival, shaped by a world that valued her name and her body more than her mind. As she grew older, another presence entered her life, Francis Derham, a gentleman in the household. Unlike Mannix, Derham treated her less like a child to be used and more like a young woman to be claimed. Their connection became deeper, more openly passionate, and far more reckless. He brought her gifts and called her wife in private. In a time when spoken promises could be as binding as a church wedding, this was not flirtation. It was a dangerous, half-formed union. For Catherine, this may have felt like a way out of the confusion around her, a promise of belonging in a world where she had little control. For the law, it was something far more serious. Those whispered vows and secret nights would not stay buried. Years later, when she wore a crown, those memories would be dragged into the light, turned into evidence, and used to destroy her. In that crowded dormitory, surrounded by careless adults and predatory men, the girl who would become queen was already walking toward the scaffold long before she knew a king would ever look her way. Francis Derham was not like Henry Mannix. He did not lurk in doorways or use lessons as an excuse. He walked through the household with confidence, a gentleman pensioner who belonged there by rank and right. Where Mannix had been cautious and calculating, Derham was bold. And Catherine, still a teenager navigating a world that had already taken so much from her, found herself drawn into something that felt different, something that felt real. Their relationship began sometime around 1538 or 1539. By then, Catherine was older, perhaps 16 or 17, and Derham treated her not as a student or a conquest, but as someone he intended to keep. He brought her small luxuries, fabric, trinkets, tokens that said she mattered. In return, she gave him access to her life in ways that went far beyond stolen glances. The dormitory that had once been a place of whispered confusion became their meeting ground. Late at night, when the household settled into restless silence, Derham would slip through the darkness to her bed. Other girls lay just feet away, pretending to sleep, hearing everything. Some were horrified, others were entertained. A few would later remember exact details when questioned under threat of treason. What made this different from her earlier experiences was not just affection. It was language. Derham called Catherine his wife. She, in turn, accepted the title in private. In an age where a spoken contract witnessed by others could hold the weight of marriage, this was not romantic fantasy. It was legally significant. They exchanged promises. They spoke of a future. To those who knew, they appeared bound to one another. But there was no priest, no formal ceremony, no family approval. Just two young people playing at permanence in a household, where rules bent easily and consequences arrived late. The relationship was never truly hidden. Servants saw. Other girls knew. Whispers traveled through the dormitory and into the kitchens, the halls, the places where gossip lived. Yet no one stopped it. The Dowager Duchess, if she knew, did nothing. The structure that should have protected Catherine's reputation instead let her drift further into a relationship that would one day be labeled treason. When the affair eventually ended, it was not because of scandal or discovery. It was because opportunity called Derham elsewhere. He left to seek his fortune in Ireland, and Catherine, still young and unmoored, remained behind. Perhaps she thought their promises were real. Perhaps she believed he would return for her. What she did not know was that those promises, those nights, those witnesses would follow her for the rest of her life. Years later, when she stood before a king and became his rose without a thorn, no one thought to ask about Frances Derham. No one imagined that a girl from a crowded dormitory could carry secrets powerful enough to bring down a queen. But the past does not stay buried, and in Catherine's case, it would rise again with enough force to sever her head from her body. For now, though, she was still just a girl, and the king had not yet noticed her. Catherine Howard arrived at court in late 1539, not as a debutante seeking glory, but as a lady-in-waiting to Anne of Cleves, Henry VIII's fourth wife. She was there to serve, to smile, to blend into the background of royal ceremony. But Catherine had something that could not be taught: youth, energy, and a kind of brightness that caught attention in a court grown heavy with political scheming and aging ambition. Henry noticed her almost immediately. He was 49 years old. His leg, ravaged by old jousting wounds, oozed constantly and filled rooms with the stench of rotting flesh. His once athletic frame had thickened into obesity. He moved slowly, spoke sharply, and ruled a kingdom where fear had replaced love. His marriage to Anne of Cleves had been a disaster from the start, a political arrangement with a woman he found physically unappealing. He called her his Flanders Marais and refused to consummate the marriage. The court knew. Europe knew. And Henry, humiliated and trapped, looked for a way out. Catherine became that way. By spring of 1540, the king's interest had turned unmistakable. Gifts began arriving from Mistress Howard. Lengths of expensive fabric, silks and velvets in colors only the wealthy could afford. 23 separate deliveries between April and June, each one a signal, each one a step closer to a trap she may not have fully understood. Her family, the Howards, saw the opportunity immediately. They were one of the most powerful noble families in England, but their position was always fragile, always dependent on royal favor. Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister and an enemy of the Howard faction, still held power. If Catherine could captivate the king, the Howards could rise. If she became queen, they could destroy Cromwell. So they pushed her forward. They dressed her well, placed her where Henry would see her, and stayed silent about the one thing that could ruin everything, her past. They knew about Manox. They knew about Derham. They gambled that no one else would speak, that the years had buried those memories deep enough to stay hidden. It was a breathtaking risk. If the king discovered that Catherine had been sexually active before marriage, it would not be embarrassment. It would be treason. A queen's body belonged to the crown. Any prior claim on it, any shadow of another man's touch, threatened the legitimacy of royal heirs and the stability of the throne itself. But the Howards believed they could control the narrative. They believed Catherine's beauty and charm would be enough. In June 1540, Thomas Cromwell was arrested on fabricated charges. By the end of July, he was executed. The path was clear. On July 28, 1540, just weeks after his marriage to Anne of Cleves was annulled, Henry VIII married Catherine Howard in a quiet ceremony. She was approximately 19 years old. He called her his rose without a thorn, his perfect jewel, his reason to feel young again. She had become Queen of England, and the countdown to her destruction had already begun. At first, it must have felt like a dream. Catherine Howard, the girl from the crowded dormitory, now wore the crown of England. She had jewels beyond counting, gowns stitched with gold thread, servants who bowed when she passed. Henry showered her with estates, with titles, with declarations of devotion that echoed through the court. To the world, she was the king's beloved rose, proof that even a ruler could find joy again. But behind the gilded surface, the reality was far more suffocating. Catherine had not married a fairy tale prince. She had married a man 3 decades older, whose body was failing him in ways both visible and grotesque. Henry's ulcerated leg required constant care. The smell was inescapable. His mood swung violently between goading affection and explosive rage, shaped by chronic pain and the paranoia of a king who had already executed 2 wives. He was possessive, demanding, and deeply insecure. The same man who called her his jewel could, in an instant, become a tyrant. Catherine was expected to perform, to be charming at banquets, to smile through ceremonies, to sit beside Henry while he conducted the business of a kingdom, and pretend she understood the weight of decisions that could mean war or peace, life or death. She had no training for this, no preparation. She had been raised in chaos, not court politics. Yet now, every word she spoke, every glance she gave, was watched and analyzed by nobles who saw her as either an opportunity or a threat. Beneath the crown, she was still a teenager, still impulsive, still craving connection with people her own age, people who did not smell of decay or speak in riddles of power. The court was filled with young men, charming, handsome, close to her in age and energy. They danced, they laughed, they represented everything her marriage was not. And Catherine, for all her new titles, had never learned how to be careful. The Howard family, who had placed her on the throne, now expected her to secure their power by giving Henry a son. The pressure was immense. Anne Boleyn had failed to produce a male heir and lost her head for it. Catherine knew the story. Everyone did. She understood, on some level, that her survival depended not just on pleasing the king, but on delivering the one thing he desired most, a legitimate son to continue the Tudor line. But she was young, reckless, lonely, and surrounded by temptations she had never been taught to resist. The months after her wedding were a strange mix of luxury and dread. Henry adored her publicly, but in private, the marriage was a performance neither could sustain. He was old. She was restless. And in the shadows of the glittering court, old faces from her past began to reappear. Francis Derham, the man who had once called her wife, arrived at court seeking a position in her household. Catherine, trapped between fear and obligation, gave it to him. It was a decision born of panic, of guilt, of a desperate hope that silence could be bought. She did not yet know that her past could not be buried, only delayed. Among the young men who moved through Henry's court with ease and privilege, one stood apart. His name was Thomas Culpeper, and he was everything the king was not. Young, handsome, full of vitality. He served as a gentleman of the Privy Chamber, one of the king's closest attendants, trusted with intimate access to the royal apartments. He dressed Henry. He attended him in private. He was part of the inner circle that shaped the rhythm of the king's days. Catherine had likely seen him before her marriage, perhaps even exchanged glances during her time as a lady-in-waiting. Now, as queen, she saw him constantly. He was always near, always within reach, moving through the same halls, attending the same feasts, part of the same suffocating world where every moment was watched and nothing was truly private. Unlike the men from her past, Culpeper was not a music teacher using his position or a pensioner making promises in the dark. He was a peer, someone from her own social sphere, close enough in age that conversation felt natural. He was charming, confident, and dangerously aware of his own appeal. And somewhere in the months after her wedding, Catherine's feelings for him shifted from admiration to something far more reckless. She began to look for him in crowded rooms, to linger when he was near, to find excuses for their paths to cross. It was not a calculated seduction. It was the behavior of a lonely young woman trapped in a marriage that felt more like captivity than partnership. Henry, for all his affection, could not give her what she craved: youth, passion, the thrill of being wanted by someone she actually desired in return. Culpeper noticed, and he responded. What began as lingering glances and carefully chosen words soon became something neither could ignore. There was attraction, certainly, but also something deeper and more dangerous, the belief that they could be clever enough to hide it, that their positions, their proximity to the king, somehow made them untouchable. It was the kind of arrogance that only youth and privilege could produce. The problem was, they were not alone. Courts were places where privacy did not exist. Servants noticed everything. Ladies-in-waiting whispered. Guards remembered who passed through which door and when. And one woman, Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, saw an opportunity. Lady Rochford had her own dark history. She had testified against her husband, George Boleyn, and his sister Anne during their trials for treason years earlier. Some believed her testimony had helped send them both to the scaffold. Now, widowed and desperate to remain useful at court, she attached herself to the young queen. She became Catherine's confidant, her enabler, the one person willing to arrange what no one else would risk. She offered to carry messages, to watch for the king's movements, to create moments when Catherine and Culpeper could meet without being seen. It should have been impossible. It should have been unthinkable. But Lady Rochford made it real. And with her help, Catherine Howard, Queen of England, began an affair that would seal all their fates. In the summer of 1541, Henry took his court on a royal progress through the northern counties of England. It was a grand spectacle. Hundreds of servants, nobles, and attendants moving from palace to palace, a display of power meant to remind the realm who ruled. For the king, it was both politics and pleasure. For Catherine, it became an opportunity she could not resist. Away from the rigid structure of London, the progress offered something rare: disorder. New palaces meant unfamiliar layouts. Temporary lodgings meant shifting sleeping arrangements. Servants were distracted by the chaos of constant travel. And in that confusion, Lady Rochford found gaps where there should have been none. The first meeting happened late at night in one of the palaces along the route. Lady Rochford stood watch while Catherine slipped through darkened corridors to a chamber where Culpeper waited. What was said between them, what passed in those stolen hours, would later be dissected by investigators desperate for details. But in the moment, It felt like escape. For Catherine, it was a brief return to being just a girl, not a queen. For Culpeper, it was the thrill of possessing what even the king could not fully control. The meetings continued. Lincoln, Pontefract. Each stop on the progress became another chance. Lady Rochford played her role perfectly, timing the king's movements, clearing hallways, making sure doors stayed unlocked. She was not doing this out of loyalty or friendship. She was doing it because proximity to the queen's secrets gave her power, made her indispensable, kept her relevant in a court that had no patience for the useless. Catherine grew bolder. She began writing to Culpeper between their meetings. Small notes passed through Lady Rochford's hands. One letter, later discovered, would haunt her. Words of longing, of impatience, of a desire that could not be mistaken for anything innocent. She signed herself his, spoke of counting the hours until they could meet again. It was evidence. Written proof in her own hand. Neither of them seemed to grasp the magnitude of what they were risking. Adultery by a queen was not scandal. It was treason. It threatened the legitimacy of any heirs she might produce, called into question the honor of the crown itself, and carried a penalty that was absolute. Death. They knew this, theoretically, but youth has a way of making consequences feel distant, abstract, like warnings that apply to others, but never to yourself. Servants began to notice. A maid saw Culpeper leaving Catherine's rooms at odd hours. A guard remembered unlocking a door he should not have opened. Whispers started, quiet at first, spreading slowly through the lower ranks of the household. No one dared speak openly. Not yet, but the knowledge was there, waiting. By the time the Royal Progress returned to London in the autumn, the affair had become routine. Catherine believed she had been careful. Culpeper believed his position protected him. Lady Rochford believed she was clever enough to manage the risk. None of them understood that their secret had already slipped beyond their control. And in November, the first crack would appear. November 2nd, 1541. All Saints' Day. Henry VIII attended Mass at Hampton Court Palace, surrounded by the rituals of faith and the weight of his own piety. He believed God had blessed him with Catherine, his rose, his final chance at happiness. He had no reason to suspect that within hours his world would fracture. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer approached the king's seat quietly, without fanfare. He carried a folded letter, unsigned, and placed it where only Henry would find it. Then he stepped back and waited. The letter had come to him through a man named John Lascelles, a Protestant reformer with ties to Cranmer's circle. Lascelles claimed his sister Mary had lived in the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk's household years earlier. She had information about the Queen, information that could not be ignored. The letter did not accuse Catherine of adultery, not yet. It spoke instead of her past, of Henry Mannix, the music teacher who had taken liberties with her when she was young, of Francis Derham, who had called her his wife and shared her bed before she ever met the king. It painted a picture of a girl who had been anything but virtuous, who had come to the marriage bed already claimed by other men. Henry read it, and his first reaction was fury, not at Catherine, but at whoever had dared to write such lies. He loved her. She was young, innocent, everything his previous wives had failed to be. This had to be slander, a plot by enemies of the Howard family, a desperate attempt to undermine his happiness. He ordered an immediate investigation, not to confirm the accusations, but to destroy them. Cranmer and the Privy Council moved quickly. They brought in witnesses from the Dowager Duchess's household, people who had lived alongside Catherine during those years. At first, they were cautious, reluctant to speak against a queen. But under pressure, with the threat of their own ruin hanging over them, they began to talk. Mary Lascelles confirmed the details. So did others. Henry Mannix was found and questioned. He admitted to inappropriate contact with Catherine, though he tried to minimize it, to frame it as youthful foolishness. Then Francis Derham was located and arrested. Under interrogation, he confirmed the relationship, the promises exchanged, the nights spent together. He tried to claim they had been contracted, almost married, as if that would somehow lessen the crime. It did not. If anything, it made it worse. A pre-contract to another man meant Catherine's marriage to Henry might be invalid. It meant she had deceived the king, entered into a royal marriage while bound to someone else. It was fraud. It was treason. But even as the Privy Council compiled evidence of Catherine's past, they stumbled onto something far more dangerous. Whispers about the present. Servants mentioned late-night movements. A name kept appearing in testimonies. Thomas Culpeper. Henry still did not know. He was at Hampton Court, waiting for the investigation to clear his wife's name. Catherine, meanwhile, had been confined to her chambers, told nothing, left to wonder what was happening beyond the locked doors. The trap was closing, and neither of them understood how completely. The questioning started carefully, almost gently. Witnesses were brought in, one by one, asked to recall details from years past, to describe what they had seen in the dormitories at Lambeth and Chesworth. The Privy Council was looking for confirmation of what they already suspected, that Catherine had been involved with men before her marriage. What they found instead was a pattern of recklessness that stretched far deeper than anyone had imagined. Henry Mannix broke first. Under pressure, he admitted to what he called indiscretions, moments of inappropriate touching and private meetings when Catherine was barely more than a child. He tried to soften it, to frame himself as someone who had been tempted, but had stopped short of anything truly damning. He was lying, or at least shading the truth, but his testimony was enough to confirm that Catherine had not come to the king as the innocent he believed her to be. Francis Derham was harder to break. He had more at stake. When guards arrested him, he knew exactly what this meant. He was not just a former lover. He was a man who had called a future queen his wife, who had shared her bed and made promises witnessed by others. He tried to defend himself by insisting they had been pre-contracted, that their relationship had been legitimate in the eyes of those who mattered. But that defense only made things worse. A binding pre-contract meant Catherine's marriage to Henry might not be valid. It meant deception on a scale that could not be forgiven. Catherine herself was questioned, isolated in her chambers with no one to advise her, no family to protect her. She was 19 years old, facing men who had spent their lives interrogating enemies of the crown. She admitted to the relationship with Derham, but she tried to reframe it. She claimed he had forced himself on her, that she had been young and powerless to refuse. It was a desperate attempt to shift blame, to present herself as a victim rather than a willing participant. But the testimonies of servants, the letters, the witnesses who had seen her laugh with Derham, all contradicted her. Then the investigators uncovered something that turned suspicion into horror. Servants began speaking about recent events, not just the past. They mentioned Thomas Culpeper, late-night visits during the royal progress, doors left unlocked, Lady Rochford standing watch. A letter, found among Catherine's belongings, written in her own hand, filled with longing and unmistakable affection. When Culper's name entered the investigation, the entire nature of the case shifted. This was no longer about youthful indiscretion or a hidden past. This was about adultery committed while Catherine wore the crown. This was treason in its purest, most unforgivable form. Culpeper was arrested in early November. He was taken to the Tower of London, the same fortress that had held Anne Boleyn and so many others accused of betraying the king. He denied everything at first, but the evidence was overwhelming. The letter, the testimonies. Lady Rochford, desperate to save herself, confirmed every detail of the meetings she had arranged. The interrogations had begun as an investigation into Catherine's past. They ended with proof of a conspiracy that reached into the heart of the king's own household. And Henry, when he finally learned the full truth, did not weep. He raged. News of Catherine's betrayal did not reach Henry all at once. It came in pieces, each report worse than the last, until the picture could no longer be softened or explained away. At first, he clung to denial. This was his rose without a thorn, the girl who had made him feel young again. How could she possibly have deceived him like this? But denial cannot survive details. When Henry finally heard the full account, the past with Mannix, the near marriage with Derham, the secret meetings with Thomas Culpeper, while he slept unaware, something in him snapped. Witnesses speak of a king who seemed almost unhinged by the discovery. He raged that he had been made a cuckold, the one thing a monarch could not bear. It was not just personal humiliation. It was political. If his queen had taken lovers, then any child she bore could be another man's. The succession itself would be poisoned. Those around him watched as grief and fury collided. One moment, Henry was shouting for swords and punishment, threatening to kill Catherine with his own hands. The next, he sank into weeping, mourning not only the loss of his wife, but the loss of the image he had built around her. He had convinced himself that God had finally rewarded him with a pure, obedient young bride after years of failed marriages. Now, it seemed, God had mocked him instead. Yet even in his anguish, Henry never questioned his own right to destroy her. The idea that he might bear some blame, that his age, his temper, his expectations had trapped a teenager in an unbearable situation, never entered his mind. In his world, the king was never at fault. Those who disappointed him were either ungrateful, wicked, or both. Catherine, meanwhile, was sealed off from him at Hampton Court. One day she was queen, gliding through glittering halls, surrounded by attendants. The next, she was a prisoner inside her own apartments, her jewels taken, her household dismissed, the royal canopy above her bed suddenly meaningless. She begged to see Henry, to speak to him, to plead for mercy face to face. He refused. He would never look at her again. This refusal was its own kind of sentence. Every other decision about her fate would now be made by men who understood exactly what the king wanted to hear. The counselors, sensing his mood, shaped their language carefully. They spoke of treason, of danger to the realm, of betrayal on a scale that demanded the harshest response. No one dared suggest compassion. No one reminded him that she was 19. Henry's rage had another target as well, the Howards. The family who had placed Catherine before him now looked less like loyal servants and more like conspirators who had knowingly offered him a compromised bride. Whether they had truly understood the full extent of her past hardly mattered. In the king's eyes, they had gambled with his honor and lost. Arrests began. Interrogations widened. The fall of one teenage queen was about to drag others down with her. From this moment on, there was no path back for Catherine. No confession that could save her. No explanation that could soften what Henry now believed. His love had turned to loathing, and in Tudor England, the distance between a royal favorite and a condemned traitor was only ever one mood swing away. While Catherine remained locked away, stripped of title and hope, the men connected to her faced their own reckoning. Thomas Culpeper and Francis Derham were tried for treason on the 1st of December, 1541. The outcome was never in doubt. Treason trials in Tudor England were not about discovering truth. They were about confirming what the king had already decided. Both men were found guilty, but the sentences handed down revealed just how deeply personal Henry's fury had become. Thomas Culpeper had been the king's favorite, a trusted member of the Privy Chamber, someone Henry had once treated almost like family. That intimacy made the betrayal cut deeper. Yet even in rage, Henry granted him a mercy, beheading. It was a noble death, reserved for those of higher rank. One clean stroke of the axe, quick, relatively painless. Culpeper would not suffer beyond the terror of knowing his moment had come. Francis Derham received no such consideration. He was sentenced to the full horror of a traitor's execution, to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. It was a punishment designed not just to kill, but to obliterate, to turn a human body into a warning. He would be dragged through the streets, hanged until nearly dead, then cut down while still conscious. His abdomen would be opened, his organs removed and burned before his eyes. Only then would he be beheaded, his body hacked into quarters and displayed across London. The disparity between their sentences spoke volumes. Culpeper's crime was more recent, more direct, more threatening to the crown. Yet Derham, who had known Catherine years before she ever met the king, faced the worst death England could devise. Perhaps it was because he had dared to call her his wife, a claim that mocked Henry's marriage itself. Or perhaps the king simply needed someone to absorb the full weight of his humiliation. And Derham, lacking noble blood and royal favor, made an easy target. On December 10th, both men were taken to Tyburn, the execution ground west of London, where crowds gathered to watch justice performed. Culpeper went first. He knelt. The axe fell. It was over in moments. His head was taken to be displayed on London Bridge, a grim trophy meant to deter others from similar betrayals. Then came Derham. What happened next is not described in full by contemporary sources, but the nature of the sentence leaves no room for mercy. The process was designed to take time, to allow the condemned man to feel every stage of his destruction. By the time it ended, Francis Derham had ceased to be a person and become an example. Their heads were mounted on spikes along London Bridge, positioned where travelers entering the city would see them immediately, rotting reminders that the king's city had limits and his vengeance had none. Catherine, confined miles away, would soon be brought down the Thames by barge on her own journey to the Tower. She would pass beneath those same spikes. She would see what was left of the men who had once held her, touched her, believed they could possess her without consequence. By then, she would already know her own fate was sealed. The problem facing Henry and his council was not whether Catherine deserved punishment. That had already been decided. The problem was legal. Under existing law, executing her was complicated. Her past relationships had occurred before her marriage, and there was no statute making premarital conduct by a future queen treasonous. As for the affair with Culpeper, proving adultery required evidence that was difficult to establish beyond doubt in a court setting. The letter helped, but legal proceedings could drag on, invite scrutiny, and allow Catherine or her defenders to challenge the narrative. Henry wanted certainty. He wanted finality. And he wanted it without having to sit through a public trial, where his humiliation would be dissected for all of Europe to witness. So Parliament created a solution. They changed the law. In January 1542, a Bill of Attainder was introduced. Unlike a trial, an attainder did not require the accused to appear or defend themselves. It was a legislative act that declared guilt by proclamation. Parliament simply voted that the accused was guilty, and the sentence became law. There was no jury, no testimony, no chance for mercy or appeal. It was efficient, ruthless, and entirely legal. The bill declared that any woman who came to the king's bed with a history of unchastity without disclosing it beforehand had committed treason. It did not matter that no such law existed when Catherine married Henry. The statute was applied retroactively, turning her past into a crime punishable by death. Her relationship with Derham, her silence about Manox, even the circumstances of her youth, all of it now carried the weight of treason. Lady Rochford was included in the same attainder. Her crime was enabling the meetings between Catherine and Culpeper, knowingly assisting a queen in adultery. She had stood watch, carried messages, lied to protect them. In the eyes of the law, that made her a conspirator. By late January, Lady Rochford had suffered what witnesses described as a complete mental collapse. Some reports suggested she had gone mad, unable to comprehend the fate closing in around her. But Henry showed no interest in her condition. Another clause was quietly added to the law. Even the insane could be executed for treason if Parliament decreed it. On January 21st, 1542, both women were condemned. Catherine Howard and Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, were declared traitors by Act of Parliament. No trial, no defense, just words on parchment, signed by a king who had once promised Catherine the world. The execution date was set, February 13th. Arrangements were made. The scaffold on Tower Green was inspected and prepared. The executioner, the same man who had beheaded Culpeper weeks earlier, was informed. Fresh straw was ordered to lay beneath the block. Catherine and Lady Rochford were moved to the Tower of London to await their deaths. They had just days remaining, and in those final hours confined to cold stone rooms with no hope of rescue, both women faced the same terrifying question. How does one prepare to die when death is not an abstract idea, but a wooden platform and a sharp blade waiting just beyond the door? February 10th, 1542. The morning was cold and gray when Catherine Howard was led from her confinement at Sion House and brought to the Thames. A covered barge waited at the water's edge. Dark wood and drawn curtains meant to shield her from curious eyes. But there was no real privacy. Guards flanked her. Witnesses watched. Everyone knew where she was going and why. The journey down the river was slow, the oars cutting through water that reflected nothing but winter clouds. Catherine sat in silence, surrounded by men whose job was to ensure she did not escape, did not speak, did not do anything but wait for what came next. She was no longer a queen, no longer even Catherine Howard, really. She was a condemned traitor being delivered to the place where traitors died. As the barge approached the tower, it passed beneath London Bridge. And there, mounted on spikes high above the water, were the heads of Thomas Culpeper and Francis Derham. By now they had been exposed to the elements for weeks. Birds had done their work. Flesh had rotted. What remained were grotesque remnants, barely recognizable as human, left to decay as public warnings. Catherine would have seen them. There was no way to avoid it. The bridge was the gateway into the heart of London, and those heads were placed precisely where they could not be missed. Whether she looked directly at them or turned away, the knowledge was there. The men who had once desired her, who had touched her, who had believed themselves safe in her presence, were now nothing but carrion displayed for the amusement of strangers. The barge continued to Traitor's Gate, the water entrance to the tower. It was a passage soaked in history and dread, the same route Anne Boleyn had taken 6 years earlier. The iron portcullis lifted. The barge slipped beneath the stone archway, and Catherine stepped onto the landing where so many before her had arrived, knowing they would never leave. She was escorted through the tower grounds to the lieutenant's lodgings, the same apartments that had housed Anne Boleyn during her final days. The rooms were comfortable enough, furnished for nobility, but they were still a prison. Guards stood outside. Doors were locked from the outside. Every window offered a view of the fortress walls, a reminder that there was no escape, no rescue coming, no miracle that would undo what had been decided. 3 days. That was all the time she had left. 72 hours to reconcile herself with the fact that her life would end on a scaffold in front of witnesses, who would later describe every detail. 3 days to think about the axe, about the block, about the moment when her head would no longer be attached to her body. For most people, the idea of their own death remains abstract until the very end. For Catherine Howard, it was immediate, certain, and scheduled. February 13th, 7 o'clock in the morning, and there was nothing she could do but wait. On the night of February 12th, with less than 12 hours remaining before her execution, Catherine Howard made a request that would become one of the most haunting details in Tudor history. She asked her attendants to bring her the execution block. Not a replica, not a symbolic gesture. The actual wooden block upon which she would die the next morning. Her attendants, stunned by the request, hesitated, but Catherine was insistent. She needed to see it, to touch it, to understand exactly what would be required of her when dawn came. And so, in the dim light of her chamber, the block was carried in and placed before her. What followed was a scene almost unbearable in its quiet horror. Catherine knelt beside the block. She studied its surface, the worn wood stained from previous executions. Then, carefully, she positioned herself as she imagined she would need to do. She leaned forward, laid her neck across the wood, adjusted her hands, felt the cold press of timber against her skin. Then she rose, repositioned, and did it again. Again and again, through the long hours of that final night, she practiced, kneeling, placing her head, rising, repeating. Her attendants watched in silence, unable to offer comfort, unable to look away. There was no hysteria in Catherine's movements, no wild grief, just a desperate, methodical focus on getting it right. She was terrified of a botched execution. She had heard the stories. Everyone had. Executions that required multiple strikes. Axes that missed the neck and struck shoulders or skulls. Condemned prisoners who suffered not a swift death, but prolonged agony while the executioner hacked away, trying to finish what he had started. The thought of that kind of pain, that kind of public failure, was more than she could bear. So she practiced. She needed to position her neck perfectly, to keep her body still, to make the executioner's job as simple as possible so that when the blade fell, it would be over in an instant. No second strike. No struggling. Just one clean cut and then nothing. It is impossible to imagine what those hours felt like for her. A 19-year-old girl, alone except for silent attendants, rehearsing the mechanics of her own death, trying to take control of the one thing she still could, how she would meet the axe. The rest of her life had been shaped by others, by men who desired her, by a family that used her, by a king who discarded her. But this, at least, she could manage. She could die well. She could make it clean. By the time dawn began to lighten the edges of the windows, Catherine had practiced enough. She knew what to do. She understood the angle, the pressure, the way her body would need to hold still. She was as ready as anyone could be for something no one should ever have to face. Outside, on Tower Green, the scaffold was waiting. The executioner had sharpened his blade. The crowd of nobles, required to witness, had begun to gather. And Catherine Howard, who had once been called a rose without a thorn, prepared to walk toward the only certainty she had left. Dawn came quietly to the Tower of London on February 13th, 1542. No bells announced it. No ceremony marked the hour. Just pale winter light creeping across stone walls and the muffled sounds of a fortress preparing for execution. Catherine woke, if she had slept at all, to the knowledge that these were her final hours. There would be no reprieve, no last-minute pardon. Henry had made his decision, and kings did not change their minds once blood had been promised. She dressed carefully, choosing her clothing with the understanding that it would be stripped from her body after she was dead, divided among those who had served her in these last days. Everything she wore would outlive her. By 7 in the morning, the scaffold on Tower Green was ready. Fresh straw had been scattered across the platform to absorb what would come. The block, the same one she had practiced on through the night, sat at the center. The executioner stood nearby, his axe sharpened, his face covered. He was experienced, chosen specifically for his skill. This would not be a public spectacle like Tyburn. This was a private execution, witnessed only by a small assembly of nobles and officials required to confirm that justice had been carried out. Among those gathered was the Earl of Surrey, Catherine's own cousin. He watched as guards led her from her chambers and across the green. She was so weak with terror that she had to be supported. Her legs barely held her. Her face was pale, drained of the color and life that had once captivated a king. This was not the vivacious girl who had danced through Hampton Court. This was someone who had spent weeks waiting to die, and now faced the final, irreversible moment. The walk from the lodgings to the scaffold was short, perhaps only 100 paces, but it must have felt endless. Each step brought her closer to the platform. Each breath might be one of her last. The crowd stood silent, watching. Some may have felt pity. Others likely felt satisfaction, convinced that she had brought this upon herself. Most simply wanted it to be over, to return to their lives and forget they had witnessed a teenager's execution. Catherine reached the scaffold steps. She climbed them slowly, her attendants still holding her arms, steadying her. At the top, she stood for a moment, looking out over the assembled witnesses. The tower loomed around them, its walls indifferent to what was about to happen. Somewhere beyond those walls, Henry was going about his day. He would not come. He never did. This was the moment she had prepared for. The block waited. The executioner stood ready. And Catherine Howard, who had once been called Queen, who had worn a crown and slept in palaces, now had only one task left: to kneel, to place her neck where she had practiced placing it, and to trust that the hour she had spent rehearsing would be enough. She took a breath, and she began to speak. Catherine's voice, when it came, was thin and unsteady. This was not a moment for eloquence. There would be no grand declarations, no defiant final words that historians would quote for centuries. She was 19 years old, moments from death, and every word had to be chosen carefully. Any hint of defiance could be seen as unrepentant. Any claim of innocence could be twisted into further proof of her guilt. So she said what was expected. She acknowledged that she had been justly condemned. She admitted that her actions deserved the punishment she was about to receive. It was the script every condemned traitor was expected to follow, a public confession that validated the king's justice and reassured those watching that order had been maintained. Whether she believed it or not was irrelevant. To say otherwise would have been pointless and cruel, extending her suffering without changing the outcome. She asked for forgiveness, not from the crowd, but from the king. She prayed aloud that Henry would be granted health and long life, that God would bless him and guide him. It was a strange thing to say, asking mercy for the man who had ordered her death, but it was necessary. Even in her final moments, she could not be seen as cursing the crown. To do so would have tainted her soul in the eyes of the church and dishonored whatever small dignity she had left. She requested prayers for her soul. This mattered more than anything else, she said. In the religious landscape of Tudor England, death was not the end. What came after depended on the state of one's soul at the moment of passing. Catherine needed people to pray for her, to intercede on her behalf, to believe that despite everything, she could still find salvation. Without that, her death would be not just physical, but eternal. Her words were brief. There was no time for long speeches, and she likely did not have the strength for them. Unlike Anne Boleyn, who had used her final moments to deliver a carefully crafted address that both defended her dignity and subtly critiqued those who condemned her, Catherine simply spoke the necessary phrases and then fell silent. She turned toward the block. This was the moment her practice would matter. She had spent hours the night before learning how to position herself, how to kneel without trembling, how to place her neck so the executioner would have a clear, unobstructed target. Now, in front of witnesses, with her hands shaking and her breath shallow, she lowered herself to her knees. She leaned forward, her neck settled onto the worn wood. Her hands gripped the edges of the platform to keep herself steady. The executioner stepped closer, adjusting his stance, measuring the distance. The crowd held its breath. Catherine closed her eyes. Everything she had been, every mistake she had made, every moment of fear, and joy and confusion, all of it came down to this: a girl kneeling on a scaffold, waiting for a blade to fall. And in the cold morning air of Tower Green, the axe rose. The axe fell in a single practiced stroke. For all the fear that had consumed Catherine's final night, the end itself was brutally swift. The executioner, chosen for his skill, did not hesitate. One clean blow, and the body that had once captivated a king was suddenly still on the scaffold, separated from the head that had worn a crown. There was no second strike, no prolonged agony. The hours she had spent rehearsing her position had done all they could. What followed was out of her hands. Silence hung over Tower Green for a heartbeat. Then the formalities resumed. The executioner lifted Catherine's head briefly, as proof the sentence had been carried out, then set it down. There were no cheers, no wild reactions. This was not a public spectacle for the London crowd. It was a controlled, contained act of royal justice. The nobles present had seen such things before. They would see them again. In the Tudor world, even the death of a queen could become a grim routine. Catherine's body and head were gathered quickly, wrapped in cloth. There was no coffin, no elaborate funeral, no procession through the city. She had once been Queen of England, anointed and celebrated, but traitors did not receive state burials. Her remains were carried the short distance to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, the small church within the Tower walls where so many of Henry's victims already lay. Inside that chapel, beneath the stone floor, rested Anne Boleyn, Catherine's own cousin and the king's second wife, condemned on charges of adultery and treason just 6 years earlier. Nearby lay George Bullen, Thomas More, and others who had crossed Henry's path and paid the price. Catherine was placed among them in an unmarked grave, her body committed to the earth without monument or inscription. No plaque named her, no statue marked the spot. For generations, visitors would walk over her resting place without knowing. Immediately after Catherine's execution, Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, was brought to the same scaffold. Where Catherine had been consumed by fear, Jane seemed broken, her mind fractured by weeks of imprisonment, and the knowledge that she had helped arrange the very meetings that sealed both their fates. She too was beheaded, her body taken to the same chapel and buried without fanfare. Two women, tied together in life by dangerous secrets, now lay side by side in death, reduced to anonymous bones beneath the Tower floor. Henry did not visit the chapel. He did not mark the day with open mourning. Instead, life at court shifted with chilling speed. Within weeks, talk turned to politics, alliances, and the question of who he might marry next. The girl who had once been his rose without a thorn became, in official records, a cautionary tale. A queen whose light behavior and false heart had threatened the stability of the realm. Centuries later, during Victorian renovations, workmen opened parts of St. Peter ad Vincula and tried to identify the remains of those buried there. Anne Boleyn's bones were tentatively distinguished and reinterred with a memorial. Catherine's, if they were ever found at all, were not singled out. Her exact resting place remains uncertain, lost among the many nameless dead of the Tower. Today, her name appears on a single memorial plaque inside the chapel, listed alongside others executed on Tower Green. No effigy, no grand tomb, just letters carved in stone, quietly acknowledging that a teenage girl once wore a crown, died in terror, and vanished beneath the floor of the fortress that killed her.